Welcome, directors and family resource liaisons, to the Kids Net in the Know training series funded by the Clipper Ship Foundation. This is the third session in a series of 4 trainings focused on supporting foster parents around issues regarding substance use. We are recording this webinar so that you folks will be able to reference this session in the future. Just so you know, you can type in any questions you may have at any time during my presentation, and I'll be sure to answer as many as I can during the presentation and of course at the conclusion. I really come to this topic and understanding parents and the perspective that they experience in struggling with substance use disorder. I also come from the experience of helping support foster families, pre-adoptive families, families that are dealing with DCF, and the way that addiction impacts families all across the spectrum. So I hope that this will give me a good place to start talking about this. And I think part of what this place where I hold both the experience of parents in recovery and the experience of working with families and foster families and children impacted by addiction, what that does is gives me a good insight into this in-betweenness. And I think this in-between place is something that you yourselves as family resource liaisons know very well. And hopefully this will be a big part of what we talk about going forward, this in-between place. Thank you. I come to you from the Institute for Health and Recovery, and it's my pleasure to work with them because I think part of what the Institute for Health and Recovery does best is that it is able to hold this in-betweenness in all the ways that we help work with people. That means we are statewide, we have offices all across the state, and we try to support families from all across the state, whether it's through counseling, outpatient, in our tobacco education, in our recovery and family recovery program support. So I feel like this gives not only the in-betweenness to my work, but to the setting that I come from. And hopefully that helps all of you in terms of your work here. So goals for today. We have some ambitious goals. And the first is that we'd really like for us to review, discuss, think about addiction and substance use disorders and how they impact families. I think the part that we want to think about is not only how do they impact families, but what does that mean for foster and pre-adoptive families? How are you holding both the family, the child, the biological parent, and the greater system that you're working in? So that is a big goal, I know. We also are going to talk about how to support adoptive and foster families in talking about these issues and being able to communicate around issues of addiction and to be able to broach the subject, because sometimes even starting that is the hardest part. And then for you as FRLs, how to support families in this position, in this situation. So we'll start, I'd like us to start here, where I'm asking you, as we go through the topic today, to think of a child, a parent, or family that you have worked with, that you have known, that has impacted you, and that you feel your work has impacted. And I'll start with a story with a child that I worked with. And this was meant almost 12 years ago when I worked as an intern in a CBAT program, and a boy named, I'm going to call him Dean for the sake of this presentation. He was 4.5 and came to me, and he was smart and bright and vivacious, and his life was impacted by addiction and substance use. He was in the CBAT for over 4.5 months because both his mother and father were impacted by addiction and could not help support him. And then I always think about Dean when I do this work, because for me, as a young clinician and new in the field clinician, I really struggled with trying to hold Dean's pain and the way that it broke my heart, and be able to be empathic and empathetic and have compassion for the parents who are struggling with an addiction. I bring up the story not because not because I want you to always be concerned only about the child, but because I really hold this. Because the second part of my work was when I got to join IHR and to work with parents who themselves were in recovery or were struggling with a substance use disorder. And part of why I feel blessed to have this experience is because I was able to take the heartbreak and the pain and the sadness of working with this little boy, Dean, and also see the parents and their own pain, and that very likely, very often, the parents themselves were once this 4-year-old boy. And so as we go through this work today and this presentation today, I hope you too will think of somebody that you know that has been impacted by addiction, that you'll be able to hold these two very difficult things, which is understanding the context of addiction and also holding the pain and impact for children. And as we talk about these very difficult topics, I'm just going to offer this reminder to choose your own emotional safety and distance, and to be able to, as you need, take the space, take a break, notice when things feel hard, and also to make sure that in your work with families that you are offering that same kind of space and distance as needed. And what that can mean for you, it can mean pausing and coming back to this. It can mean coming back to this at another time, or not thinking of this family or somebody that you feel has been impacted by addiction. I'm going to ask you to make that decision. So let's get started. I think as we start, there's a few things that I want us to just keep in mind. The first is that SUD, so substance use disorder, right, comes from a place, we understand that it is a pervasive chronic disease. So some guiding principles, and I think it's important for us to have some shared principles and guiding values that we know as we go into this discussion today, and also in the work that we do. Partly that's because I think as we come up with questions, as we get into those sticky situations where we're not sure what to do, having these guiding principles is what helps us understand and be able to think about, wait a second, let me take a step here. Let me think about what I really need to do to help this family, help this child, help myself in the moment. So the first is I want us to remember that substance use disorder, and I will be using SUD or substance use disorder interchangeably, is based on a disease that's pervasive, it's chronic and progressive. And what that means is for parents who experience this or for people who experience this, it continues to get worse. And we will talk more about this and what that looks like. Of course, we want to remember that there are biological and genetic elements, and that is a big component, but it's not everything. And sometimes when we are feeling hopeless or when we are feeling overwhelmed by fear, the kind of catastrophic thinking that we can all do sometimes is to go to this biological and genetic, but we remember that in the context, it is a big part of it, but it's not all of it. I think at the heart of what I believe in my time working with parents and families and what I hold really dear is that parents want the best for their kids. And that addiction can get in the way. And those two things sometimes are at odds with each other, but they happen to both be true. And the way that that looks in families, I think you can speak to it, and we'll be able to speak more in terms of examples. The other thing I like to keep in mind as we present, as we talk today, is the impact of trauma. And not only the impact of trauma on the families that you work with, but perhaps our own impact of trauma in the children, and how all of that comes together, and a system, because in the system itself, it also experiences trauma. And so when somebody from DCF reacts in a certain way, we also want to think of it in the context of trauma, because that is a very important part that we all experience. There's a big system, but we are people in that system. So something that I want us to keep in mind as we talk today. I think the part that still makes my job enjoyable and hopeful is that I have seen and experienced and understand what it means when I say recovery is possible. I also know the heartache and the pain that families and children and providers experience when we see and witness a relapse or a lapse. That has a profound impact especially when we see, for example, a child that is feeling hopeful and that is taken away when there is a relapse or a lapse. And so for all of us to remember both recovery is possible, relapse is part of recovery, and the greater impact of what happens when there may be a relapse for the biological parent. I think it goes without saying that we want to think of the family history of substance use disorders and the kind of context that that may provide. But as we said beforehand, it is just one element. It isn't the only element, but it's that big picture that we're working in and the context that we talk about and meet with the families. And this is probably too big to fit into one guiding principle, but I think remembering culture, the impact of culture and racism, discrimination, and of course stigma as we're working with families, with foster children. These are not insignificant, and color and impact every interaction that we are having. So it's something for us to remember whichever place we come to it. It's big, but it's very relevant. So what is this context? And this is really the context that you are probably meeting families, which we know 60 to 70% of all substantiated child welfare cases and 80% or more of parents whose children have been placed in foster care have some substance use disorder. That is a huge context. And that is a big, big number, which means that in some way, the foster children that you are working with are very likely to have been exposed and touched, their lives touched and impacted by substance use disorders. And so that speaks, I think, to how relevant this topic is and how important it is that we're talking about it and thinking about it and thinking about how it impacts you and how it impacts the families and how to best support you and the families. We say this because the context, we know there's no such thing as a baby and just a baby, right? It's a baby and there's always someone. And that goes for children and as they grow. And part of what I like to think about as I work with families is this idea of reflective functioning. And I think for all of us, at the core of what we're trying to do with all parents is to be able to build reflective functioning. This is a concept that was described by Peter Fonagy, and he says, parents are most likely to respond sensitively when they can understand the meaning and intention of children's signals and see their children as separate from themselves. And one of the most beautiful examples I have of this was I was at the gym one time and I saw this mother walking with her youngish daughter. And just as they were walking, they passed by somebody who was holding a very heavy weight and dropped the weight. Big, loud noise. And the child just froze, probably in terror, right? That trauma response, but froze and had no reaction. And it wasn't until the parent bent down and very gently touched her shoulder that the child was able to just burst into tears. And that to me is a perfect example of reflective functioning, of the child of being able to respond and react because somebody was able to think about their experience. This is not easy for all of us. And if we take in this greater, so if we think about the context that we talked about beforehand of the substance use disorders and add in poverty, discrimination, and all that we know that often comes, we understand all the things that can get in the way for parents to be able to have this reflective functioning. And so as you're doing your work, whether it's work with foster and pre-adoptive families or parents in general or with children, for me, that the place where I find hope is where I can think about we are trying to build the capacity for reflective functioning. So again, going back to this, where are you meeting parents? Often you're meeting foster families who have been impacted by this little upside down pyramid. And in the research, Oliveros and Kaufman talked about how with 100 parents who were required to complete a substance use disorder treatment or lose custody of their children, or their children were placed in foster care, they found that only 64% were able to complete an intake interview. Only 50% attended some treatment, and only 13% completed treatment. I imagine that in your work and in your positions and your work with family, you know this more than anyone because you are working with the families who could not quite get to complete treatment at least not this time. So I think this is the context that we know that you are seeing families and seeing the family system. And holding that in mind, I think can be part of that pain that we can connect to. So I still think about that boy, Dean, right? He's somebody who experienced this, parents not being able to complete the treatment that was provided. And he held all that. And then for myself as a clinician, I was holding his pain. And so we know that as you're doing your work, you're seeing this, you're experiencing this. And so thinking about what that means for you. And then of course, how to be hopeful and how to help support families in this context. I know this is a slide that's familiar for you from previous trainings, but I think it's a good reminder to all of us when we say substance use is a disease, what does that mean? And I think back to a parent that I worked with. She was at a training that I was giving. And at the end of the training, we all circle around and we talk about what impact has this training had for me. And this mother pointed to another person across that circle and said, I don't know if you remember me, but you were my DCF worker when I lost custody of my children. And at that moment, when I lost custody of my children, all I could think about was they're better off without me. And that story resonates for me when I think about, well, yes, it's a disease, but what does that mean, right? It means that in that moment, your pleasure senses, you're not able to experience the kind of pleasure and joy that you normally would from connection with your children. And what does that look like? It looks like that mother who says, my children are better off without me. I think the context that we talked about beforehand in terms of the genetics, right? We know that genetics account for 50% of the risk for substance use disorder. That is both hopeful and not hopeful, because it speaks to what you're going to be seeing, right? You're going to be, the families are taking in children who hold this 50% risk. But I think what's important for us to remember is that other factors play a role: environmental, attachment, the kinds of relationships that we can help build and support, biological and socioeconomic. And so we want to put that greater context, because it would be easy to go to the place of hopelessness if we are only thinking about genetics and biological. So that, I think, is the place where we want to support and to be holding in our mind. This greater context, and we see this, and it goes back to what we talked about in terms of trauma. We know that 60% of youth with PTSD will develop substance use disorder. We have research around women with a history of childhood sexual abuse. They're more likely to have alcohol problems. 70% are more likely to have used substances. It highlights just the kinds of risk factors and the kinds of things that the families are dealing with. And so I know that in the context of your work with them, you're holding these statistics too, because you're thinking, well, what if? And the parents are thinking, the foster parents are thinking, well, what if? And so part of what we want to think about is how do we support families as they deal with these what if questions, and in the reality when their children may be experiencing, when they may be using substances as a way to self-regulate. So why do people use substances? And I put this slide in, I think, because it's important as we think about later talking with perhaps older youth or with children and being able to talk to them, what is addiction? We have to know why substances have become a coping mechanism for the biological parents. So partly we want to remember that initially people start to use substances to feel good. That you may use substances to alleviate stress, boredom, anger, all the kind of self-regulation that, if nothing else is able to help you regulate, substances may provide a temporary but very powerful relief. Of course, there's some social acceptance around it. As we talked about, it helps with managing some hard feelings, mental health symptoms, and self-medication. I've heard people say that it works until it stops working. We see people that may use it for sleep, to stay awake, to deal with some pain, chronic pain, study, help concentrate. These are all the ways that people may start off to try to use substances, but the people who experience substance use disorders, it's when that has gone beyond, when these things are no longer working, when the substances are no longer helping to alleviate some of these things. So what is the impact of substance use disorder on families? At the heart of what we know and what we've seen is that the disease of addiction is a disease of disconnection. And so we have where, for example, we have this unit of the family that's supposed to serve as our initial self-worth. It's supposed to teach us how to communicate. It gives us the rules for living and our links to society. And you have this disconnection. And so you are meeting the families and the children, and the families trying to support these children, and they've experienced a big disconnection. And how we see that, we see the children are impacted by their ACEs and their environment. So one example is this mother, Janelle Hanchett, and I put in her picture here. This is from the book that she wrote. And she wrote a book about her own experience with addiction as a mother. And I think she is a good storyteller for the real experience of what it's like to be a parent struggling with addiction. And so I'm going to read her words and use her words to describe her own experience with addiction. I think an experience that many people can relate to. So she says, the comment that stuck with me like a knife in my brain is this one. Yeah, addiction isn't a choice, but shoving a needle in your arm sure as hell is. It's as if people think we start off with a needle in our arm. Yeah, newsflash, we don't. Alcoholism and addiction and are progressive diseases. They get worse over time. We don't start off with a damn needle in our arm. We start drinking beer with friends in high school. We start like you did. And by the time I realized I was in trouble, I couldn't stop. By the time I realized I couldn't stop, I couldn't stop. I think that's a powerful description of a parent who experienced addiction and could see how her life was deteriorating, but also was using substances to be able to protect and shield her from experiencing the pain of her life as it was deteriorating. It's part of the understanding that addiction isn't a choice, and yet it feels like a choice to everyone around there. So when you are talking with the children, and we will talk more about this, it is easy to go to the place of, well, why can't my mother or my father just stop? And sometimes we ourselves may have those experiences. Sometimes the foster families may have those experiences and thoughts. And those are a very natural reaction to a disease that feels very, very powerful and very personal. And yet, as we talked about beforehand, we know the changes in the brain mean that this isn't a choice. I think part of that is what we hold as we are talking to families. And as we're thinking about it and thinking about the foster families who are taking in the children, and they may be seeing all these different impacts of the biological parent substance use disorder on the child, because we know that active addiction and substance use disorder may interfere with child's emotional needs being addressed. We can see that sometimes their developmental stages may be delayed because the relationship, right back to that disconnection, the disease of disconnection has interfered with their developmental stages. We also know that often children who grow up in substance use disorder with parents who have substance use disorder may have been exposed to traumatic events that may impact their attachment or other disorders. One of the ways that I like to think of it is to use Maslow's hierarchy of needs, because we can think of all the ways in which a parent who is struggling with addiction and substance use disorder may not be able to attend to a child's physiological needs. They may not be giving them food and water as needed. They may not be able to provide them the shelter or clothing, making sure that they are sleeping regularly. If we go up that pyramid, they may not be able to provide the safety and security needs. They may not be bringing them regularly to health appointments or doctor's appointments. They may not be able to give the kind of stability. And again, that goes into the next step, which is the love and belongingness. Because if all those bottom ones may be impacted by this biological parent's substance use disorder, it is hard to be able to attend to the love and belongingness needs. So back to that reflective functioning, that is being interfered with. When we say it's a disease of disconnection, that's another place where it's being disconnected. And as we know, children are developmentally appropriately self-centered, right? For them, the world revolves around them. And so how they may understand things is around their own needs and their own impact on the biological parent's substance use disorder. And so how that impacts self-esteem, their confidence, their feeling of achievement and capability and being able to competence in this world may be impacted. And then of course, to the higher level of self-actualization, of how it impacts their creativity, their spontaneity, their understanding and making an ability to make deeper meaning and be able to input that creative self. I've included this slide because as you are working with families, it's important to also think about the various ways that children may be displaying this reaction. So these are physical reactions to trauma, but I think because we already discussed the trauma is a big part of possibly very big part of the experience of children who grow up with some with their biological parents experiencing substance use disorder. We may see an interference for sleeping, right? We can see interference with their eating, their toileting, so bodily functions. We can also see some emotional responses, so these are behavioral responses, dissociation or hyperarousals, and how this may look for a child, right? It may be diagnosed as ADHD or ODD, all the kinds of diagnoses that foster families are often getting as they are being told about this child. And so remembering that bigger context of trauma, I think is helpful for all of us as we think about this. Another place where I feel is important for us to remember is back to this communication. I'm just reading a question here. So somebody asked, can you speak to the rebuilding pieces that children may have missed with bio parents? So, I mean, I think that's a big question, so thank you. But I think part of it is, every case is both individual and there may be some universalities, where if the substance use disorder takes the parent away from the child and their ability to self-regulate, help the child regulate, help them meet the different developmental milestones that we want them to meet. When you are working with a family, they have to kind of become investigators to find out, who are we seeing here? What is going on? And sometimes it's not apparent because children become very good at both compensating. So if they don't feel good in one place, they may find lots of ways to show the family that they feel good in another. So there may be a lot of investigation that is happening. And I think this goes back to the reflective functioning, that part of what we want to do in working with families is having them be able to work, to reflect, to think, what is this child communicating right now? How has this form of communication served them in the past? And how may it be getting in the way for them right now? So it's a big question, but I think that's the place where you can support families in being those investigators and being open to thinking about, because we all have buttons, and children are especially good button finders and button searchers. And so they may have found the one button and they are trying to communicate a need, but they're not quite aware of what they need at that moment. And so without that full awareness, they just know they found a button and it's meeting a need for them to push that button. So I think as family resource liaisons, what you want to be doing is helping families think about what are the buttons, how that's impacting them, and then the greater questions of how you can support families. And feel free to ask further questions as we go along. So thinking about this communication, right? Part of what we often see with families where there was a substance use disorder is how the lack of communication, how the talking, right? It's that truism of the elephant in the room, that nobody is talking about this. And then there's all this conversation that may be happening around it. And so if we think of children who are creating the world around themselves, they are trying to make sense of the world. And often what that means is they're making sense that if only I hadn't left my bike out, maybe Dad wouldn't have gotten angry and wouldn't have walked out the door, and he wouldn't have drank, and then he wouldn't have relapsed. And oh no, this is my fault. And so thinking about those kinds of messages that children may be interpreting and how they are putting their own frame around it because of the kinds of messages and lack of communication that has happened around the addiction in the home. Or maybe they've heard too much, because there are certainly families where the children hold all the information, are told everything, and there's no place for them where they can say, well, that's too big for me to hold. And so when we are thinking about the families and what that looks like in a foster family, is back to that investigator. You are trying to figure out just how much has this child been told, how much has this child been exposed to, and then how can we support them? And we'll talk more about that conversation piece. One of the things that the Hazelden publication put out are often these 3 family rules that happen with families when there's substance use disorder. And the first is the don't talk, don't trust, don't feel. And when we think about those 3 rules, we think about what it means for a child to take that in. And if you are a family that is taking in a foster child where that family rule was don't talk, and then they have a need, what does that look like for the child who is trying to communicate that need? Well, they don't have the language to communicate that need. They don't even have the language to know that they have the need. And they may have been consequences to communicating that need. So that don't talk is one of those rules that they may have internalized that is so deep that it may feel antithetical and difficult for them when you start to ask them questions, or when you start to say, well, what happened? Or we can talk about this. And so thinking about how to support a family where they are trying to break down that rule, it takes a lot of work and a lot of patience. And I think that goes to that big one on the second rule, which is don't trust. Because you are not going to talk to somebody else about your feelings and your needs when you don't trust them. And you may not even trust yourself with your feelings and your needs. So that already creates more barriers. Back to that slide of the disconnection, here are all the ways that substance use disorder has gotten in the way of attachment and disconnection and connection and created disconnection. And again, the don't feel. So that's a place where not only is the child disconnected with the world around them, they may be disconnected with themselves and how they are feeling. So when you're holding these 3 rules, that's a big challenge for anybody. But you're trying to help support families in overcoming these invisible rules. And I think the first place to start is to even notice, and to be able to support families in noticing pre-adoptive parents and foster parents and being able to notice, oh yes, this was a coping strategy. Of course you don't talk about this. Of course you don't trust. Of course you don't even know how you're feeling, because these were the tools that you were given, or the lack of tools that you were given. And I think that wraps up thinking about the trauma, because when we see people react. When we often see the fight, the flight, the freezing, or submission. And those 4 trauma responses, they don't always feel very good in a family context, or they're not always conducive when you're wanting the child to go to school and sit and learn, or be in a team, in a sports team, and follow the rules. Because when the responses to anything that feels overwhelming is fight, flight, freeze, and submit, we as a society don't always have the kind of understanding for the trauma response. And we see children feeling confused and overwhelmed by their emotions. And that impacts the system, because not only do the children sometimes respond with fight, flight, freeze, submit, we ourselves, when experiencing that, may experience those feelings. And so you may see families who are struggling with a child where at every turn they are yelling and fighting and punching walls. And that family or that foster parent may experience that by freezing or just wanting to run away or give up. And so being able to even notice the patterns. So if we're thinking back to that investigator and the kind of investigative support that we want to give families, noticing your response and the child's response and how they may be interplaying is a very important part of the trauma responsive care that we want to provide. So noticing when people are feeling confused and overwhelmed by their emotions, or maybe their emotional responses are disproportionate. So it feels like, well, this was a very small thing, and here the child has just run away and given up, completely ready to let go and not do anything more. So being able to even notice and have empathy and compassion that, oh, wait a second, this may be a trauma response. I think this brings us to the place of this inherent dilemma that you as family liaisons have, which is holding back to this in-between place, right? Because we are trying to help foster and pre-adoptive parents balance the compassion for the bio parent. And that takes a lot of work when they are seeing the real experiences and how the substance use disorder impacted the children that they are caring for. So they are trying to balance that with their concern and care for the child. So I want to throw this out to all of you to think about, how do we help foster and pre-adoptive families balance this? And we're going to think about this in-betweenness as we continue to talk right now. I think one of the most beautiful gifts that we have in working around addiction is Al-Anon and Alateen. And they have what they call the 7 C's. Because if you are working with families, and I think this goes back to the question of how do we help with the reconnection, I think the messages that we want foster children to be able to take in and foster families to be able to support are these 7 C's. So the first is that I didn't cause it. The second is I can't control it. And the third is that I can't cure it. Those are powerful things for children to be able to hold and accept. And I think as a foster family, you are trying to support them in understanding that. And what I like is the second part of it, which is you may not have caused it, but you can care for yourself. You can communicate your feeling by making healthy choices and celebrating yourself. And I like these 7 C's as a kind of guide for the work that we are doing in working with families and foster families and children, because I think they get to the core of what the work is really about. It's about supporting the care, the communication, the understanding that there are choices, and that we can celebrate the choices that you make. So what does that look like? 2 different pictures, very different experiences, but in working with foster families, sometimes they have experienced and discussed that visits are that one of these places where all those feelings, that balance of trying to hold the care and compassion for the biological parent and the love and care that you have for your foster child, it's a pinnacle where those 2 things often conflict. So what does that mean? The The first is that we want to help foster families and pre-adoptive parents notice, prepare, and validate their mixed emotions. So that in-between place means it's a place of mixed feelings. And as you're working with foster families and pre-adoptive families, what you want to do is normalize, expect that these feelings will be there. They are a natural part of the situation that we are putting foster families and asking pre-adoptive parents to think about. And so to be able to just notice and accept that these feelings are natural. I think another place where we can help foster families is in modulating expectations, and thinking about how do foster families help to do that for their children as well, for the foster children, because there may be a lot of expectations and lots of opportunities for disappointment. So being able to prepare, even to be able to speak about what some of those expectations look like and what they may feel like, I think is an important place that foster families and foster children can start to think and prepare for visits. Another place that we want to help foster families and foster children is to notice and prepare for triggers. Thinking about what a visit means. A child may be time traveling. And what I mean by time traveling is that they are meeting the parent, the biological parent right now. They may be thinking about all the things that happened in the past, or they may be worrying about all the things that could happen in the future. And so that child is often time traveling and going back in place, and could be feeling overwhelmed by those by that time travel, but by all that takes place in their mind before, during, and after visits. So being able to prepare for that, I think, is helpful. The other place that we want to help foster families is to notice trauma responses, and to sometimes be able to open up what trauma response, what they think of as a trauma response, because sometimes it's easy to see when somebody is being angry. We can note that as a trauma response. It may look very different if a child is just being quiet, or if they're freezing. And so back to that building of the reflective functioning, to be able to put yourself in your foster child's experience, and to be able to think about what they may anticipate, what they may experience depending on the situation, I think is important for parents and for foster families. The next one, practice self-care, is easy to put on. I'm sure you've heard it lots of times, but what does that really mean? And I think we'll talk a little bit more, but part of what we want to think about, all of us know how we should be a little bit healthier, eat a little bit healthier, exercise more, drink less coffee, maybe smoke less, or go out for walks more. And yet sometimes in the moment when you are feeling overwhelmed, that decision to be able to take something that's healthy, so I'm going to go out for a walk when I'm feeling overwhelmed, or take some deep breaths, or making the decision to, well, I'm just going to have a cigarette or something else. The space between those, to get to that bridge, is how do we set up our lives? What kind of routines and schedules have we put into our lives to be able to make those? Because it's easy to be calm when everything is going well. That's not the time when you need self-care. The time when you need self-care is when things are not going well. And we are often flooded by our overwhelmed feelings. And so to be able to put in place the things that are easy, accessible, and supportive of your self-care. And then, of course, I think helping parents remember to give themselves permission to take their time. A lot of times, and I think we are all caught in this situation where you feel like you have to respond right away. That doesn't always mean that that is the best thing for yourself, for the families, for the biological parents, for the foster children, for the foster families. And so being able to have the time and know, you know what, we're going to take a minute and think about this before I respond, so that we are responding, not reacting. On the video. So we're gonna watch a short video, and as we watch this video, I'm gonna ask you to think about both what, it's about a visit. I'm asked you to think about, A, how would we support the child, and how would we support the foster and pre-adoptive parents before and after the visit. So we're going to watch this, and then we'll come back to the discussion points we had.
A lot better. I've been cleaning for like a week now. That's great. Yep. And there's this place that I can go, this treatment center. Stay that way. Problem is, I can't afford it. I wish I could help, but I don't have any more. Well, if you don't have cash, I mean, there probably is something at your house. Something that you guys don't use. Something your moms wouldn't miss. And then you can give that to me and I can sell it. I just really want to get better, you know? I don't think I can. It's just, we're family. You know? And family takes care of family. You know?
So that is obviously a poignant example. A poignant example of. Okay.
Sorry,
That's okay. Okay, we're back. So that's obviously a poignant example of how a visit with a biological parent maybe did not go so well. So thinking about, back to this, how would we notice, prepare, and validate the mixed emotion of the children, of the foster parents? Best case scenario, that foster child is coming back to you and telling you what just happened. And as a foster family, you are going to be experiencing a lot of emotions. Right? Again, that place of wanting to protect the child, feeling anger, resentment for the biological parent, but also holding that compassion that they are trying to get some treatment. They are trying to do what they know with the very few tools that they may have accessible. We want to think about how we support modulate expectations. So for that child that went to that visit, they may have those mixed emotions because here they are seeing the parent who apparently is doing well, is seeming to do well, and also is asking them to do something that feels wrong, that's breaking the rules. And that contradictory place puts a child in is likely to impact the child with some mixed emotions. We see this mother who's singing a song that she is doing from a place of probably wanting to connect. But we also don't know what the child is experiencing. That may be a very triggering song, because maybe that song was something positive that they experienced. Maybe there's a lot of memories that weren't so positive. And so something that seems positive may hold some triggers for the child. We can see the foster child and her response, and she's trying to back away. We may have seen a little submission, maybe some freezing, possibly the flight. We didn't see anger, but that certainly could have been there. And so being able to prepare and notice the different trauma responses to the visit. And then thinking about how would we support the foster families and the foster child around this kind of visit. And remembering that, helping families to remember that they don't have to respond right away, that they can take the time to think about this. Because if a child is coming back from a visit, most likely they're not coming and talking to you about what just happened. Because especially for a child, for somebody, a youth or a child that is conflicted, they're holding these two things because they're holding the need and desire for wanting their biological parent to get better, quote unquote, and also the kind of guilt and shame and fear that they're experiencing when their parent is asking them to steal something from their foster parent. So to also remember to give your child, to help families to give the foster child time to process this and to let them process it in a way that doesn't feel like it has to be done right away, right after the visit, because those feelings can be quite overwhelming. And if we work with foster children who may not have experienced a lot of tools, being given a lot of tools to deal with overwhelming feelings right after the visit, that's probably not the place where we want to start processing and talking about what just happened. So giving yourself and helping families to remember the time it takes to respond, not just react. Is this a new question? Mm-hmm. Okay, there is a new question. Is there a good self-care strategy that you can share with us that we can use with foster parent who maintains a very busy schedule? That's a beautiful question. I think, like everything, the best plan, it means nothing if they're not going to use it. And so I think working with a parent to figure out what are those things and what are the barriers for them from doing it. I know a lot of us talk about mindfulness, and I believe in mindfulness and breathing and all that comes with that. When I work with parents, one of the things that I like to bring up is to talk about laughter and to talk about that, because we don't often think about it in terms of the mindfulness and stress reduction, self-care, but laughter is a basic attachment tool. So if you think about what's one of the first things that a parent does with their child, right? They do the peekaboo, and then you try to get a smile. And that smile, that social smile, usually comes just when the parent is really, really tired and feeling very overwhelmed. But that child knows how to get the parent engaged to take care of them, regardless of how tired they are. And then back to, if you are watching something, it's never going to be as funny when you are doing it by yourself as when you're doing it with somebody else, because laughter is a social experience. We are geared, our minds are geared to repeating giggling. So if you hear somebody giggle, your brain will automatically giggle. And laughter has been shown to have very similar experiences as in terms of mindfulness, stress reduction. So a lot of times I will try to find ways to ask parents to think about, how can you be silly? It's very hard to be angry at somebody when you're using a silly voice and asking your children to pick up the toys off the floor. It feels a lot different for both people involved when you're using a Donald Duck voice compared to just your angry, pick up all the toys. So I don't know if I can answer all of that. I definitely want to support you in working with parents to figure that out. But I often try to remind folks that laughter is an easy thing, and a lot of people experience it as much more accessible than trying to just breathe and quiet, because sometimes in the quietness, anxiety goes straight up. So that's a suggestion. Thank you. Okay. Can you move? Thank you. Excuse me. So what are some things that we can help families think about? Before visits, we may want to think about things like the impact on routines. And what that means is, and I know visits are not always, are very unlikely to be in the control of the foster and pre-adoptive families, but we may want to think if there's any way to talk about, well, that time is really not good because that's nap time. Or can we make sure that the child gets a snack before we set that visit with a parent? We also want to be able to talk with them as about how to expect the foster child's feelings, so the anticipation, the fear, the anxiety, and excitement, and back to normalizing that they may have more than one feeling. And it's very possible to have, and very likely that they will have more than one feeling. I think it's helpful if we remember, like we said, to expect the foster parents' feelings, and also to be watching out. Early on in the presentation, we talked about how there may be somatic experiences for children who've experienced trauma, reactions. We may see that in anticipation of visits as well. So we may see children's sleep, dysregulation, acting out. So you could see some of those feelings that have not been processed, that don't have a place to go, come out in the more somatic experiences of the children. We also, as natural for foster parents to have mixed feelings, the children, foster children, may themselves pick up on their foster parents and pre-adoptive parents' mixed feelings. And so to be noticing, to help foster families to notice and regulate their own emotions. So sometimes a foster parent may experience a lot of anxiety because in the past, this visit, the mother doesn't show up. And so as another visit is coming up, the anxiety around it and the tension, children can read that, children can see that, and that adds another layer to the things that they are trying to hold and to process. And so just to help parents be mindful around how they are experiencing and sharing, and not trying to impose too much. But that, again, I think is a fine balance, because we want to be able to talk about it and to maybe name it without necessarily imposing. I don't know if there's an easy or simple way to do this, but I think part of that is the taking time, to helping foster parents to take time to process their own feelings and to notice their own feelings before they go into the conversation with their foster children. One of the things that has been suggested is to think about offering the foster child a transitional object. And so you may want to give them something both you may want to help the foster families give them something from the foster parent or the pre-adoptive parent as a transitional object. You may also want to talk to them about, can we get a transitional object from the biological parent? Because we may want to have the parent say, here's a picture, and I want you to have that, and you take that, and the next time we meet, we'll be able to look at that picture again. So to think about both the foster parents and the biological parents offering some kind of transitional object. You may also want to discuss and review the plan for before, during, and after the visit. So a lot of times in our busy lives, we are taking children from place to place, and the day is very scheduled, and we may know what's going on. We may have not prepared foster children or all children for what's coming. And I think finding the right balance and learning about the foster child, do they need a lot of time before a visit to talk about it? Or do they need just a day or two to be able to plan and emotionally be ready? That may be a trial and error situation, but to even notice that there can be differences in how much time people need to prepare, and the foster children may need more or less time. And then before or after, if you can help the foster families be involved in making a drawing, so maybe preparing the child to bring a drawing or something for the biological parent to take themselves, because they may not have a lot of things from their children. They may need some kind of connection to the child, and if you can participate that, and you can help foster families participate in that, that helps to normalize some of the complicated feelings, and yet that everybody has a place here. That it's not that the children don't have to choose one or the other. And that message of connection, I think, is important. So what else do we want to think about during visits? Back to those trauma symptoms and noticing in case the children are reliving some trauma or they're experiencing the trauma of separation. We may want to notice, we may want to be able to send a favorite activity or book for the child to share with the biological parent. And that can help anchor some of the time and also help foster families that are possibly anxious about how that visit is going to look and what will happen during that visit, if they know, oh, they're going to be reading a book and we've gone over this book and then I'll be able to read this to my child after and talk about it, that may give them something concrete to feel both better themselves about the visit, and then the children and the biological parents will feel better with the visit. It's important and difficult, but we want to support our foster families and our pre-adoptive parents on practicing talking calmly with the biological parent in front of the child. Back to that very fine balance of being able to acknowledge the mixed feelings, but also not trying to impose your feelings and the foster parent's feelings on the biological parent. And that takes a lot of time. And so sometimes offering the foster families a place to vent that feels safe. This is where you can vent with me. And then now let's think about how you're going to say this to the biological parent in a way that feels neutral and safe. And of course, we want to pay attention to the biological parents in case they mention things like reunification, any comments on foster pre-adoptive parents, and as much as we can to support foster families to respond at a later time. Visits offer a good opportunity for the foster children to connect with their biological parents, but of course they offer the biological parents a lot of opportunities to share some of their own feelings about the situation, and sometimes the biological parents haven't had a place to go and process those feelings, and so they are bringing it and putting that on the child. And so if there's a way to notice and help support foster families to expect that those things may happen, and how do we talk about them? Finally, after visits, we want to help support families to think about that transition time as a really important transition time, and to be able to think of how do we do the before and after. So is there a way that you can be there to welcome the children? Can you share how happy you are to see the foster children, and also to possibly expect that the foster children may not respond positively. They may need to just go to the room and not talk to anybody, but even to set that in. And sometimes having like a tradition of a phrase that you always say, and that's the thing that comes back, and that helps the children to know what to expect, and also to help prepare you that you have an answer and you have something to say to the child. Along those lines, helping the foster families think about planning for some re-entry ritual. One of the things I always think about around rituals is around birthdays. And if you think about your most recent birthday, most likely, unless you really don't want to celebrate, you probably had some kind of cake with some kind of candle. You probably lit that candle. Somebody probably sang happy birthday, and then you knew that was your birthday. But why are candles significant? Why is this the tradition that we do? We don't really know the background of it, or we don't usually know what it is, and yet somehow that feels meaningful. And rituals are just that kind of thing, but when they are place holders and markers, and when you can help all families think about rituals in that way, that they help to mark the time, and they help, especially when children come from a place where there was a lot of inconsistency, they help to mark time in a way that is really meaningful. So I think just thinking about the before and after, but in lots of ways, incorporating rituals and traditions is a very important thing for families and children in general, but especially for children in the foster care system. Trying to remember that, or to help foster families remember that your first inclination may be to ask, how was the visit? What happened? What did you talk about? What did you do? And children don't necessarily, most children don't process, at least at a certain age, don't process by talking through. And so they may need the time to reconnect with the foster parent before you can even broach the subject of the visit and how did that go. And noticing and allowing for time for the child to have time alone, but not to let this be so alone that you never go back and check in on them. and support them. So again, the rituals are important, having a way to re-enter, allowing for space alone, allowing for the place of reconnection, and making all this as part of the normal process. And things like concrete things like helping them look at the next date on the calendar for the visit. Any questions about those things as we think about supporting foster families? So let's get to the topic of how do we talk to our children? And what are the things that we want to do? Of course, we want to think about how to keep it age appropriate. You're going to talk very differently to a preteen, a 14-year-old, and a 3-year-old. Those conversations are going to be different. What does that mean also in terms of the child in front of you? Because they may have a little age of 14, but they may be processing at a younger age, or they may be very mature, and though they are 3, they talk about things that are a little bit beyond their age. So thinking about what it means to keep things age appropriate. Thinking about how do we make sure that we're telling the truth. And if we go back to thinking about that position, that in-betweenness that we know foster families are experiencing, the truth is challenging. The truth may be the place where the foster children are still coming to grips with their biological parents' addiction and how that impacted them. But when children are asking for it, we should try to tell the truth in a way that does not feel too overwhelming for them. I think it's important that we help support foster families to learn about substance use disorders, and hopefully some of these trainings are resources for all of you to help support families in learning about the language to use when we're talking about substance use disorder, about the disease of addiction, about how that changes a parent's brain or anybody's brain. It's very important when we're talking to children to acknowledge the impact. And that means for us to think about how to normalize the feelings that they may be experiencing and to validate that that is their experience, and also to be able to help them slowly with patience to reframe, to find some other ways to understand it. So if we're thinking about that child that is taking everything in and understanding it in their own terms, we want to validate that. Nobody wants to rush in and say, it's not your fault, you didn't have it. Although, of course, those are the messages we ultimately want them to understand. How do we both validate their experience and the impact that they experience, and go in and try to reframe it and help them reframe it? Part of that is to release the shame that comes around addiction and the stigma that we know that children, biological parents, and the family all around them may have experienced. Sometimes that means we want to put things in perspective. So that could mean having a foster parent talk to the child and say, I know today your mother wasn't able to show up, but you know what? We have a lot more times when we may plan to try to meet, and those times may work out. We want to be able to help families to invite dialogue, to know that dialogue is available and possible and a big part of taking away that shame and stigma that we talked about, but also not to impose too much dialogue, to feel like you have to talk about everything right now, right away. As always, for all of us parents, I think listening before we talk is a good rule, and we want to help support families. And how does that look like? So learning more, and if we take back that image of the investigator, we want to listen more. We want to hear more of what's going on before we can respond to it. Of course, we want to acknowledge family history and the impact of genetics and biology, but we also want to help hold the hope that genetics and biology are not everything, and that being able to support the foster children is just as important in this situation. And it's important that even though foster families want to help nurture, part of the way that we want to help them nurture the foster children is to also be very clear about what the expectations, what the limits, and what the consequences are. And to be able to set those boundaries is a nurturing gift that they can give to children, especially when children didn't experience a lot of nurturing boundaries. That does not mean that every child doesn't like to, or many children don't like to push against those boundaries. And sometimes when somebody's pushing against a boundary, it doesn't feel that good. And so you may have foster families and pre-adoptive families that come to you and are feeling frustrated because they are feeling like the boundaries are being pushed. And so to be able to go and set those in a way that feels nurturing, but still hold the boundaries, I think is a big place where you can help support foster families. And we want to think about, as we are using the language, and I hear this a lot of language, sometimes from people themselves in recovery. They will say, oh, I've been clean for 30 days or 90 days. Well, think about what that means when we use the word clean, right? The implication is the dirty. And for a child that may be hearing those kinds of words, there's a lot of, and back to this, self-centered, the world revolves around me. If mom is dirty or dad is dirty, then what does that mean about me? So just being mindful and careful around the language that we use when talking to children and talking about addiction in general. So you may want to have experienced positive or negative or have been substance-free instead of dirty and clean. One of the words that I hear a lot from parents in recovery is that they have been called addict, junkie, abuser. So much so that a lot of times they will introduce themselves. Hi, my name is Sarah and I'm an addict, or I was a junkie. And far be it from me to take an identity away from somebody. If that word is meaningful for them, they are allowed to that word. However, I think it's helpful for us to be mindful of the language that we use around that and making sure that we're not using, because the stigma that is attached to somebody that you call an addict or a junkie or an abuser goes deep into the core for children. So we want to think about those languages. And also moving away from the word abuse, although that is part of the lexicon, that often is what, if you're used to saying that, that may come out, and that is natural, but to try to practice and to notice when you're using that word, because the implication, again, is very stigmatizing, and we are trying to help lift families, whether it's foster families, pre-adoptive families, foster children. We're trying to lift them up to find a place and the reframing, so being mindful of the language. We're going to watch a video now of a story, and I may be contradicting myself a little bit, because earlier I said that when talking to children, being very direct and clear, using the truth and plain language in a way that is clear to children is obviously recommended. I'm going to also add this other part right now, which is talking in metaphors, obviously in a way that feels age appropriate. But we are, our brains are meant to be storytellers. We are geared towards telling stories and seeing and understanding things in terms of stories. And children are like that too. Children, especially in the younger age, latency age, respond very well and can understand the deeper meaning when we use metaphors and stories. And sometimes if you are working with a foster family that is struggling and having a conversation around the addiction, sometimes using a metaphor is a very powerful tool. Still making sure that we are being clear and open and direct, but the metaphor allows for a lot of discussion and a lot of play, and some of that reframing that we talked about beforehand can happen in the context of the metaphor. So we're going to watch this video now.
There's a dragon at our house. His name is Al. When Al first came to our house, he was a visitor. Came to backyard barbecue. It was not long before Al and my dad became great friends. Al was at our house more often and even went to work with Dad. My dad and Al made us laugh. My mom called the way Dad and Al acted antics. Al made Dad feel happy. After a while, Al grew bigger and moved into our house. Dad and Al came to my soccer game. Dad was late, and Al had been with him all day. We began to see the antics, and my coach asked them both to leave. Al was with us all the time. There was almost no room in the house for us. Mom told us at dinner last night that even though Dad is with Al most of the time, he still loves us. Mom has a plan for the times when Al and Dad get too rowdy. We go to a neighbor's house or to our granny's house far away. This morning, Mom made an announcement. No. Phone calls were made. In the afternoon, some men came to talk to Dad. They had dragons too. The men asked Dad and Al to come with them to a place called treatment. We went to visit Dad and Al in treatment. Dad, a smaller Al, and a guy called a sponsor are dropped off at our house by the treatment van. Dad looks better than before. Dad explained to us that Al the Dragon will always be with us. He says he has to work a few simple steps to make sure Al doesn't take over our lives again. Dad's new best friend is his sponsor. The sponsor has a dragon too. They go to meetings. Mom says, and that is not the end of the story, but the beginning of another story. The end.
Thank you. So I really like that story. It's not a perfect story. And of course, for families that are working with foster children, this doesn't tell all the story. I think the two things that I take from that story in that book is the ability to use the dragon as the metaphor and to be able to talk about all the ways in which dragons can be scary. Dragons can look friendly. Dragons can sometimes hide. And especially with younger children, the power to be able to talk in a non-direct but still very clear way, I think responds to the sense of play that children come with and that our brains are geared towards. The other reason I like that book is because it leaves it open. And so that next story may be helping the child to talk about, well, no, you're right, Al did not leave Dad, and that's why you came to me. And that is this next part. And so it leaves it open for foster parents and foster families to be able to create that next part of the story. When I was working with that little boy, Dean, we could not find any books about going to a foster family. So I created a book for him and wrote one. Probably wasn't very good, but at least it gave him some context and a way to talk about these very scary and a lot of unknowns that were happening to him as he was preparing to go to his foster family. And so if you can help families find that, whatever feels right for them, often that is a key to unlock some of the discussion, but otherwise in direct ways that hasn't been able to come to surface. I've also included in the handouts another book that was created. It's in the children's kit that has a story, probably for slightly younger children, about addiction and the biological parents' addiction. So you can use that or be as creative as the foster families are willing to be. So a dragon may not work for them, but they may want to use the tiger or something else to talk about this. We talked a little bit about this earlier, about laughter, but I want to underscore the way that play and laughter go together and how much families, individuals, and children and parents benefit from being able to play. Because that basic attachment activity where the child and the parent are looking eye to eye. That may be as simple as throwing a ball back and forth, but a ball being thrown back and forth requires some of that reflective functioning that we're trying to build. And sometimes that's just a very safe and simple way. But if you can have the families throw that ball fast, if that ball can be a squishy ball, if you can throw more than one ball at one time, if you can bring that sense of connection through play, families may find more ways to connect and to work against that disconnection that that has come to them with the foster child. So it not only helps connect the foster families, but it also helps to unlock some of those attachment and the disconnection that they've experienced as a result of the earlier substance use disorder of the parent. And again, I think for all of us, as we do this work, to remember the profile of a resilient child. I don't know where Dean is today. This is 12 years ago, so he may very likely be experiencing his own addiction. He may very well have gone off to a foster family who then adopted him and is doing great or struggling a little bit. We don't know, but I think to be able to hold out hope that some of the connections that we were able to build help to bring in the resilience. And I think at every point where we can bring in some kind of point of connection, we are helping to build resilience. And so that goes for the foster families, and that goes for the foster child, and for the biological, and the whole system, because we are trying to help connect. Connection breaks off the disconnection of the substance use disorder. As we're gearing up towards the end, I want us to just think about all the ways in which you and your families may interact with DCF. And I am certain those are imperfect at best. We talked a lot about the DCF is trying to come in, and they have an impossible job. They are trying to protect the children. They're being told to also make sure that they're keeping the families intact. They're also wanting to make sure that foster families are being supported, and that all these players and pieces are being put together in a way that is best for the child. And sometimes that is a near impossible task. As family resource liaisons, I think you are those in between. And so as much as that is an uncomfortable position, I think you will find yourself more and more in this in-between place. And so the gift that I feel like you can give to the families is being able to help, hold, support, validate their experience, and then also work towards helping them to understand this other system, the way in which DCF may interact, the way in which DCF makes choices or creates a service plan. And so even being able to be that liaison is very powerful for families. I think what that means is working, which I know that's something you do, to align with a foster family and to earn their trust. None of this work will be beneficial to anybody if you can't work on that connection and that basic building block. And again, you're holding the child, the foster family, DCF, and bio parents position all. That's not an easy position. And so remember to not only help the families to regulate their emotions, but your own emotions and your self-care, because you too may be holding a child that is very dear to you, that you worry about, that you think about, or you may be holding your own experience with the foster care system. And so to be able to notice your experience and how that is impacting you is a big part of the work. There's no way that you can be of use to the families or to the system or to the children if you're feeling overwhelmed by your own emotions. That helps to manage the communication. We want to make sure that we are attending to our feelings and our experience, and that we're balancing both advocacy and empowerment. And that requires a big part of cultural humility and knowing that we are open and we are here to support and we don't know everything. And so we are open to learning. And then I put other because I'm sure that you yourselves could fill that list with thoughts and ideas. And as we're getting to the end, I want us all to remember, and all of you to remember, that what you do has value. And I'll read this quote. We know only too well that what we are doing is nothing more than a drop in the ocean. But if the drop were not there, the ocean would be missing something. And I think that speaks back to all the places in which we are trying to build connection and we are trying to support connections. You are there putting your little drips, and we don't know how much water and drips it would take to turn the ocean from salty to clear water, but we know that we're going to keep putting those drops in. So thank you very much for today. I'll open it up for some final questions as we wrap up. And I will just point out that there are some resources here that you may find helpful to supporting parents. Are there any questions as we're wrapping up? I did include some children's books and website resources. Some of the books are better than others. I think reading them and trying them out and seeing which one appeals to you and to the families that you're working with. So we'll finish here. Thank you very much for your thoughtful questions and for attending this webinar. I hope I was able to help you think about this and help you think about how to support families and foster children. And to remember for yourself just that in-betweenness is not an easy position. And so we know we are asking you to do some impossible things, but we also know that your effort makes a difference, and the children and the foster families and the biological families appreciate that. So thank you for all you do, and have a good evening.